Clara's life was built on the simple belief that nothing could tear her family apart. But when her husband, Richard, is found murdered in their own home, the shocking truth shakes her to the core. Her son, Evan, is the killer. As the investigation unravels, Clara must confront the devastating reality that the child she raised may have been hiding a darkness she never saw coming. What could drive a son to murder his own father? The Smith family had always been the picture of normalcy, a typical suburban family living in a quiet neighborhood. Richard, a successful businessman, and Clara, his devoted wife, had built a life together that many admired. They lived in a well-kept house on Maple Street with a manicured lawn and a two-car garage. Their son, Evan, was 17, an average teenager who played soccer, hung out with friends, and attended school like most other kids his age. They were the kind of family everyone thought of when they pictured a perfect home life. Comfortable, secure, and happy. No one would have guessed that beneath the surface there were cracks forming, waiting to be exposed. That all changed one fateful evening in November. Richard was found dead in their home, the victim of a brutal gunshot wound to the head. Clara had been out visiting a close friend when the tragedy occurred. When she received the call, it shattered her world in an instant. She could barely process what she was being told. Richard, the man she had spent almost 20 years of her life with, was gone, taken in the most violent way imaginable. Her heart sank as she rushed home, desperate to make sense of what had happened. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and foreign. Police swarmed the scene, collecting evidence while Clara stood by helplessly. She didn't know where to turn or who to trust. In the chaos, the first question was simple. Who would want to kill Richard? There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a robbery gone wrong, and no history of threats or violence against Richard. To Clara, the notion of her husband being murdered was unthinkable. Yet the police were not ruling anything out. As the investigation began, Clara clung to the hope that this was just a tragic random act of violence. But deep down, she had no idea that the answers would be far more chilling than she could ever imagine. Clara's world was spinning. She couldn't fathom the reality of what had just happened. Richard was gone, taken from her in an instant, and all she had left were questions. The police arrived quickly, asking her questions she couldn't answer, needing details she didn't have. Who would want to harm Richard? She couldn't even entertain the idea that someone might have a reason. Richard had no known enemies. He had always been a hard-working, kind man. At least, that's how Clara saw him. There had never been any indication that anything was amiss in their lives. In the days that followed, Clara tried to hold it together for Evan. He was her priority now. He was the only family she had left. Yet as the police continued their investigation, Clara began to notice things that disturbed her. Her son, once so close to his father, seemed distant and withdrawn. It wasn't just grief. There was something more. Evan, who had always been open about his feelings, barely spoke about Richard's death. When Clara tried to comfort him, he shrugged her off, retreating into his room for hours on end. He barely ate, barely slept. Clara chalked it up to shock, to the strain of the tragedy. After all, Evan had lost his father too, but something didn't sit right with her. The way he acted was off. He didn't show the raw emotion she expected from someone who had just lost a parent. Instead, he seemed almost detached. There was no rage, no tears, just silence. And when she did manage to get him to speak, his words were curt, disinterested. Clara tried not to let her growing unease show. She kept telling herself that Evan was just processing the grief in his own way. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She needed answers. But every time she tried to dig deeper into what was going on with Evan, he seemed to slip further away from her. The grief she had expected to feel was now joined by a creeping fear that the death of her husband might be tied to her own son in ways she wasn't ready to face. The days following Richard's death were filled with a haze of phone calls, funeral arrangements, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Clara tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the house felt emptier with each passing hour. The police had not shared many details, but they assured her they were doing everything they could. Yet, despite their best efforts, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. Clara watched as detectives came and went, searching for clues, but each time they left, they took more of her hope with them. It wasn't until the police returned, with new questions, that Clara began to feel an unsettling shift. They had gone through Richard's personal files, spoken with his business associates, and interviewed neighbors. At first, there were no obvious leads, nothing that seemed to point to a motive. But the detectives had one crucial question that Clara couldn't ignore. They asked about Evan. Clara's heart sank. She couldn't understand why they would want to question her son. Evan had been home the night of the murder, but so had she, and she had left just a few hours before Richard was killed. It was a simple arrangement. Clara had been meeting a friend for coffee. She couldn't have imagined Evan would be involved in any way. Still, the detectives were persistent. They questioned her about Evan's relationship with Richard, if there had been any signs of conflict between them. Clara had to admit, there had been some tension in the last few months. Richard and Evan had clashed more than usual, especially over Evan's grades and his increasing disinterest in school. Richard was a perfectionist, and his frustration with Evan's lack of motivation had caused several heated arguments. Clara always tried to mediate, but she knew things hadn't been perfect. Yet even with these tensions, she couldn't imagine them escalating into something as horrific as murder. She told the detectives everything she knew, but they seemed to be pushing for something more. The unease that Clara had been feeling for days now began to grow into something more substantial, a deep, gnawing dread. She tried to ignore it, but she knew that the police had a reason for asking about Evan, and that reason, she feared, was something she wasn't ready to face. The possibility that her son could be involved in his father's death was unthinkable, but as the days passed, Clara couldn't deny the mounting sense that the truth was slipping further from her grasp. As the investigation into Richard's murder deepened, the police began to focus more and more on Evan. Clara, who had hoped the whole ordeal would be over soon, was left in a state of confusion and fear. She wanted to believe her son was innocent, that it was all just a tragic accident. But the mounting evidence didn't add up. The police had requested access to Evan's phone, and reluctantly Clara agreed. The device, once just a tool for daily communication, now seemed like a potential smoking gun. Clara had no idea what they would find, but as the investigators sifted through Evan's messages, the truth began to unfold in ways she could not have anticipated. At first, nothing stood out. There were texts between Evan and his friends, photos from school, and typical teenage chatter about parties and homework. But as the detectives dug deeper, a few things caught their eye, things Clara couldn't have known. One message in particular stood out, sent just days before Richard's death. Evan had sent a text to a girl at school, expressing his frustration with his father. He had written about how Richard was controlling, how his father constantly belittled him, and how he couldn't wait to get away. The message was filled with anger, resentment, and bitterness, and it painted a picture of a relationship far darker than Clara had ever realized. The detective showed Clara the text, and her heart sank. She hadn't known the extent of Evan's feelings toward his father. It wasn't just normal teenage rebellion, it was something more, something dangerous. Clara's mind raced as she read the words, the weight of what they might mean settling heavily on her shoulders. Could her son have harbored this much anger? Had Richard's discipline pushed Evan to the edge? The police didn't stop there. They continued to dig, finding more messages, more signs of a strained relationship. Clara's shock deepened with each revelation, but nothing hit harder than the discovery that Evan had been making plans to meet the girl, and in those plans, there was a strange sense of urgency. Clara's mind reeled. Had Evan been planning something? Was this all a build-up to the terrible, unthinkable act that would unfold that night? As the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, Clara felt herself losing the grasp she had on her family. Every step closer to the truth felt like another layer of betrayal, and the heartbreaking question remained, how much had she really known about the person her son had become? The more the police uncovered, the less Clara recognized her son. Every new detail felt like another blow to her already fragile world. She couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something had been hiding in plain sight. Something she had missed all along. The text messages were just the beginning. As the investigation continued, the police delved deeper into Evan's behavior over the past year. They discovered he had been skipping school more often than he admitted, lying about his whereabouts, and engaging in a series of secretive activities that no one, not even Clara, had known about. His friends, when questioned, revealed that Evan had begun to withdraw more and more, pushing everyone away. Even the people who had once been close to him described a growing darkness, a change in his personality that no one had quite understood. Clara was forced to confront the reality of what had been going on behind the scenes. She tried to recall the last few months, the moments where she had noticed his increasing irritability, the slammed doors, the late-night arguments. Richard had always been strict with Evan, pushing him hard to succeed, to follow the rules. Clara had chalked it up to typical father-son tension. It wasn't until now that she began to see how deep the cracks had run. Richard's expectations had become a pressure cooker, and Evan, it seemed, had been slowly suffocating under it. But, even knowing all of this, Clara couldn't bring herself to believe that Evan was capable of murder. It felt like a cruel nightmare, a twist of fate she couldn't escape. She couldn't imagine her son, her child, turning that anger into something so violent. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The gun that had been used to kill Richard had been found in Evan's room, hidden away in a drawer. The police found his fingerprints on the weapon, clear, damning proof that Evan had been the one to pull the trigger. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Evan's actions, his coldness, the gun, each piece of evidence pointed to him, and Clara was left to grapple with the horror of what her son had done. She wanted to scream, to cry, to wake up from this nightmare. But no matter how hard she tried, the truth was sinking in piece by piece. The man she had married was gone, and now, the child she had raised seemed like a stranger to her. How could this have happened? What had pushed Evan to such an extreme? Clara's grief now came with an overwhelming sense of betrayal, a betrayal so deep it threatened to consume everything she had left. The discovery of the murder weapon in Evan's room was the breaking point for Clara. For days she had tried to convince herself that the police were wrong, that there must be another explanation. But now there was no denying it. The gun, a .38 caliber revolver, had been registered to Richard. It was the same weapon that had been used to end his life, and it had been found hidden in her son's room. The evidence was clear, the fingerprints, irrefutable. Evan had touched the gun, had likely held it in his hands before it ended his father's life. Clara couldn't breathe. The truth was suffocating. The authorities wasted no time. Evan was arrested and charged with the murder of his father. As the police led him away in handcuffs, Clara was paralyzed with disbelief. How had things gone so wrong? She watched as her son was taken from the house she had once thought of as a safe haven, the walls now a silent witness to the crime. She couldn't comprehend it. She still couldn't bring herself to believe that Evan, the boy she had raised, could be capable of such violence. But the gun, Clara couldn't ignore the gun. It was right there, in Evan's room, in a place where only he had access. That fact haunted her more than anything. Questions flooded her mind. Why had Evan kept the gun? Had he planned this? If so, how long had he been planning it? Clara couldn't understand why her son had never come to her with his pain, his anger, his frustrations. Why hadn't he reached out? It seemed like Evan had been living in some private, tormented world, a world that Clara hadn't even known existed. She thought she had been a good mother, attentive and loving. But somehow, her son had fallen through the cracks. The detectives kept pressing, trying to piece together Evan's motives. Clara was desperate for answers, but every question they asked only deepened the mystery. They learned that Richard had been more than just a strict father. He had been controlling, pushing Evan beyond his limits. Was that the cause of Evan's rage? Clara tried to convince herself that there had to be more to the story, that maybe there were other factors she didn't know about. But the evidence was there, and it pointed directly to her son. Evan had been the one to pull the trigger, and the question Clara couldn't shake was simple. Why? What had driven her son to such a brutal, irreversible act? The more Clara learned, the more she realized that she might never know the full extent of what was going on inside Evan's troubled mind. As the investigation unfolded, the truth about Evan's troubled state became harder for Clara to ignore. It wasn't just about a moment of rage or a single argument that had led to Richard's death. It was the culmination of months, maybe even years, of unresolved tension. The detectives, now piecing together Evan's life in painstaking detail, began to uncover a dark pattern. It seemed that Evan had been living a life full of secrets, a life that Clara had never seen. She had always thought of him as a typical teenager, rebellious at times, but nothing out of the ordinary. She hadn't realized the depths of his inner turmoil, how isolated and angry he had truly become. Clara learned that Evan had been hiding much more than she had ever suspected. He had been skipping school, a pattern that had been going on for months. While she had chalked it up to a lack of motivation or maybe teenage laziness, the truth was far more unsettling. Evan had started withdrawing from his friends, spending more and more time alone in his room, his only company the walls that had once felt like a sanctuary. Clara had tried to reach out to him, but each attempt to connect was met with distance, and sometimes outright hostility. One of the most shocking revelations was that Evan had begun to experiment with alcohol and even drugs. The friends who had once surrounded him now admitted that they had seen a drastic change in his behavior. Evan, once the boy who laughed and joked with them, had grown sullen and unpredictable. His sense of self-worth had taken a hit after his constant battles with Richard, who had never been satisfied with Evan's grades, his social life, or his dreams. It wasn't just that Richard was a strict father, he was a domineering one, often making Evan feel like he was never good enough. But Clara hadn't seen any of this. She had been so focused on keeping the family intact, on managing the home and her own work, that she missed the warning signs. She realized now that Evan had been battling something far deeper than just the usual teenage angst. There had been a constant pressure building inside him, one that had eventually exploded in the most horrific way. The idea that her son had been suffering in silence for so long was something Clara could hardly bear, but it also left her with a devastating question. Had she failed him? Had she missed the signs of his pain, not realizing how close they were to the edge? And was there anything she could have done to stop this from happening? As the investigation into Richard's murder continued, the chilling details of that fateful night began to emerge. Clara's mind was overwhelmed with disbelief, struggling to piece together the fragments of her shattered reality. The night Richard was killed, Clara had been out of the house, visiting a friend she had known for years. She remembered the conversation she had with Richard before leaving. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that anything terrible was on the horizon. Evan had been at home, alone with his father. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary evening, a time when Clara could unwind and catch up. But the moment she returned, everything changed. When Clara arrived back home later that night, she was met with the horrifying sight of the police in the living room, their presence thick with grim purpose. Richard's body had been found sprawled on the floor in the study, a pool of blood staining the carpet beneath him. Clara felt as if the air was being sucked out of the room. She couldn't even scream. Her legs felt weak, and her mind couldn't process what had happened. How had Richard ended up like this? How could he be gone, just like that? It wasn't until later that the investigators began to reconstruct the sequence of events. They learned that Richard and Evan had been alone in the house for hours, a detail that made Clara's stomach churn as she recalled the strained silence she had often noticed between them in the past. According to the police, there had been an argument, one of many that had occurred over the past few months, a result of Richard's unrelenting pressure on Evan. Witnesses later revealed that the argument had been heated, filled with sharp words and accusations, with Richard demanding that Evan take responsibility for his future. The detectives pieced together Evan's movements from security footage around the house. After the argument, they saw Evan retreat to his room, visibly upset. Richard, in turn, had remained in the study, attempting to calm down. The footage showed that sometime later, Evan had left his room, but this time, he hadn't returned. Instead, He had entered the study, where his father was sitting at his desk, still working. In an act of shocking violence, Evan had used the very gun that had been registered to Richard, the same weapon kept in a drawer in the study. The police couldn't confirm whether Evan had planned the murder in advance, or if it was the result of a violent, unrestrained outburst. But the evidence pointed to a deliberate act of rage. The gunshot wound to Richard's head was a close-range shot, suggesting a moment of intense anger, a final, irreversible expression of all the frustrations Evan had been carrying. Clara's heart shattered. Her son, the boy she had once known, was the one who had taken her husband's life. It was too much to bear. The questions began to flood her mind. Had Evan been planning this for months? Had he been plotting revenge, or had his actions been the result of a single devastating confrontation? What had truly driven him to commit such an unforgivable act? The more Clara learned, the more she realized that the answers would be far darker than she could ever have imagined. As Clara continued to grapple with the reality that her own son had killed her husband, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She couldn't escape the constant replay of the events that had led to that fateful night. What had gone wrong? What had driven Evan to such a horrifying act of violence? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. But they didn't make any sense. Nothing made sense anymore. The trial was set to begin, and Clara found herself dreading each passing day. She was now forced to confront the truth in a way that felt like a never-ending nightmare. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, some part of her son was still reachable, that this act of violence had been the result of a breakdown, a temporary moment of madness. But the more the prosecution revealed, the more she realized that Evan's anger had been simmering for a long time. The psychological evaluation presented by the defense didn't help ease her mind. The expert spoke of unresolved issues, of the pressure Evan had been under for years, and how that pressure had created a deep sense of resentment toward Richard. But none of it explained why Evan hadn't come to her for help, why he hadn't confided in her. Clara sat through the trial in a daze, unable to fully absorb what was happening. Her son's defense painted him as a victim of his circumstances, an impressionable teenager who had been pushed to the edge by his overbearing father. But Clara knew that there was more to Evan's story than that. She had witnessed the strained relationship, but she hadn't seen the depth of Evan's despair. Had she been too blinded by her own expectations of what their family should be? She thought of all the years she had spent trying to keep up appearances, trying to make everything look perfect. Maybe, in doing so, she had failed to see the cracks in her own son, the pain he had been hiding. Evan's silence in the courtroom haunted Clara. He showed no emotion as the evidence was laid out before him. He was distant, as if he were already far removed from the person he had been. It was as if the boy she had once known had disappeared, leaving behind a stranger who had committed an unthinkable crime. Clara couldn't help but wonder, was Evan lost to her forever? Could she ever understand the person he had become? Each day of the trial brought her closer to a terrifying conclusion. Evan had not only destroyed their family, but he had also destroyed something inside her, something she wasn't sure she would ever be able to repair. The trial dragged on, each day a painful reminder of the unbearable truth Clara had been avoiding. As the prosecution presented its case, detailing the evidence against Evan, Clara felt like she was being torn apart piece by piece. Her son, the boy she had raised, was now the person standing trial for the murder of her husband. The courtroom felt like a foreign place, an alien world where nothing made sense. The faces of the jury, the sharp voices of the attorneys, it was all too much. Clara's eyes rarely left Evan as he sat motionless in the defendant's chair, his once lively face now blank, distant, almost unrecognizable. The defense tried to paint Evan as a victim of circumstance, emphasizing the abusive nature of Richard's parenting and how Evan had suffered in silence for years. They argued that Evan's actions were not premeditated, that it had been an explosive outburst of rage, a culmination of all the pent-up frustration he had experienced. They spoke of his emotional instability, his isolation, and the pressure that had been placed on him by Richard's demanding expectations. Clara, hearing these words, wanted to scream. Yes, she had seen the arguments between Richard and Evan. Yes, she knew that Richard had pushed their son too hard at times. But nothing, could explain or justify what had happened. The turning point came when the defense called Evan to the stand. Clara's heart raced as her son was sworn in. She hadn't heard him speak publicly about the events, and the tension in the air was palpable. Evan's voice, when he spoke, was cold and detached. He didn't show any emotion as he recounted the events of the night his father died. He described the argument, the moments leading up to Richard's death, but his words were matter-of-fact, as if he were speaking about something that had happened to someone else. Clara tried to read his face, searching for any trace of guilt, regret, or sorrow, but found nothing. The final moments of the trial came, and Clara was left to face the devastating reality that the son she had tried so hard to protect and understand had destroyed her life in the most unimaginable way. Evan was found guilty of second-degree murder, and Clara was left with the unbearable task of reconciling her love for him with the incomprehensible act he had committed. As the courtroom emptied, Clara felt numb, as if she were floating through her own life.